Hello everyone, and welcome to the final episode of History of Judaism in 5 Foods. Today's topic, a Talmudic fisherman, Chagall's herring, and Rabbinic Sushi, the Jewish love of fish from Egypt until today. This is a very exciting episode of our lecture series because, much as when you would watch, say, Cheers, the TV show would always begin with Cheers is filmed before a live studio audience. And today we have a live studio audience for our presentation, which will be followed by a herring party. This has been arranged for those who have given at a certain level to our fundraising campaign. And if you have not yet given at that level, please do, if you're watching this, consider doing so, because there will be other events that will follow, including a very special conversation with Elizabeth Ehrlich, the author of what I think is the greatest book in English on the religious meaning of Jewish food, Miriam's Kitchen. That will be happening very soon before Shavuot. So if you're watching this on Tuesday, please consider continuing to give. This is our fundraising campaign for the year, and we need all the help that we can get. In that spirit, I want to thank all of the underwriters for this lecture series. Stacy and Oliver Stanton, an anonymous underwriter; the Solomon family, another anonymous underwriter; Karen and Jack Darr, the Roberts family; Madeline and Stan Down, another anonymous underwriter; Louis Bateman, Sharon Dane and Gail Propp, Rose and Morty Landau, Juan Mesa Friedel, the Nathan family, Carol and Alan Schechter, and Susan and Warren Stern. Thank you to all the underwriters of this series. And I want to thank all of the sponsors of this lecture: the Sisterhood of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, Debbie and David Sable, Aviva and Marvin Sussman, Malika and Anthony Bregman, Judy and Albert Milstein, Nicola and Philip Garcia, Raymond Jazin, Carla and Jonah Shine, Lou Steinberg and Michael Schulder, Sarah and Warren Sherman, Dr. and Mrs. Stephen Siskind, Linda and Howard Sterling, and Rose and Henry Edinger, Ruth and Larry Cobrin, Jan Rothschild, Rabbi Gershon and Tova Siegel, Donna and Benjamin Tripp, and Doctors Margot and Douglas Wall. Thank you to the sponsors of this lecture. Everyone who knows me is well aware of my love of fish and the way that culinary affection and affectation is bound up really with my rabbinic identity. I love herring, I love lox, and I especially love sushi. Thus it is that at every wedding, whenever there is a smorgasbord, I only go to the sushi station. I don't go anywhere else if sushi is provided. Now, of course, I have to address, when I arrive at the wedding, one of the great injustices of our time, which is that unlike the other tables at the smorgasbord, where they provide a very large and round plate, at the sushi stations, as you're all well aware, they often give a very tiny plate, square and small. Very difficult to hold more than 3 or 4 pieces of sushi at most. Obviously, this is unfair, and you might say that this is the civil rights issue of our time. So what I usually do is I go first to one of the other stations, take one of the large plates, and then walk over to the sushi station, and then just shovel the sushi onto the plate. Some would call me a hero. I don't use the term hero lightly, but I am really the greatest hero in the United States, I think, for doing that, which is a line that, if you Google, you will see I fittingly took from the famous episode of The Simpsons, where Homer Simpson was thrown out of the all-you-can-eat seafood restaurant because he did not really have all he could eat. And he went to the lawyer, and the lawyer called him a hero and informed him that this was the greatest case of false advertising since his unsuccessful lawsuit against the film that was named The Never-Ending Story. Okay, so I love fish and I love sushi. Unfortunately for the sushi chefs at all the kosher caterers, they really don't understand that I'm a rabbi, which is why I'm at all these events. And they're not sure why they're always seeing me specifically at their stations. And so once I remember being at the Waldorf, a beautiful affair, I immediately went over, and I want to add this was especially excellent because another injustice is that usually the sushi station is not at the chasan's tish, the chatan's tish, only at the regular smorgasbord. But as a rabbi, I have to usually be it with the chatan. So this time there was at the chatan's table a sushi station, and I went over to the sushi chef, and she looked at me, the Japanese sushi chef, and said, "You follow me everywhere." So it's well known, even to the somewhat puzzled chefs of Foremost Catering and other catering companies, of my love of fish. And the greatest sashimi which I've experienced was, of course, in Japan. And the ultimate embodiment of quality fish in Japan is the famous tuna auction, featured in the great film Jiro Dreams of Sushi. Thus, in January of 2020, I noted with great interest a news story about a tuna auction that took place, in which the very large tuna was purchased by a man named Kiyoshi Kimura, who was also known in Tokyo as the Tuna King. And he bought, on behalf of his sushi restaurants, he bought a tuna for the price of $3 million. Not 3 million yen, but $3 million. Thus, NPR reports, quote, "The 612-pound tuna had to be wheeled into its owner's sushi restaurant on a low platform, its mouth agape. Sushi chain owner Kiyoshi Kimura purchased the immense Pacific bluefin tuna in an auction on Saturday at a Tokyo fish market. The fish sold for a record 333.6 million yen, more than $3 million, the Associated Press reported. The Kiyomura Corporation, which Kimura runs, footed the bill at over $5,000 a pound. $5,000 a pound. The fish usually sells for up to $40 per pound, though the price can fluctuate to more than $200 per pound. The gigantic tuna will translate to more than 12,000 pieces of sushi for the company's sushi Zanmai chain." End quote. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, a tuna for $5,000 a pound, which is approximately what a nice piece of meat will cost you at the local kosher supermarket. And though I'm joking, though I'm mostly joking, the truth is, of course, that there is a tremendous focus. If you go to local kosher supermarkets in New York, there is a focus on quality meat, often luxury meat, as well as luxury fish. And the price, while not 5,000 pounds, is still nevertheless very high. And indeed, this highlights a new foodieism that is sweeping the kosher world. Indeed, one which has really taken the traditional Jewish world by storm. One can find, and I have it here on the table right here, I'll grab it here so you can all see it. One can even subscribe and read a magazine called Fleischiks, which is all about new food scene. I'm a very avid reader of Fleischiks, and the newest issue is about the private chef. It's the private chef issue, because let's say going out to an omakase sushi meal is just not enough, because there you have to hideously meet other people, and therefore you want to get a private chef of your own. So you can read all about it in the newest issue of Fleischiks magazine. At the same time, there are those who have criticized this new focus on luxury eating. And indeed, one of the most revered rabbis of the 20th century, my cousin, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, once made reference in a talk on this subject to what he described as glatt kosher hedonism that he saw overtaking the traditional Jewish world. He added then, quote, "Don't misunderstand me. I am not opposed to people enjoying themselves to some extent. I am not arguing for a totally ascetic approach to life. I don't live that way myself, and what I don't practice, I certainly am not going to preach. In a sense, I don't practice it, meaning asceticism, because I don't really think that it is demanded." And then he added, "The question is something else entirely. The question is not whether there is room in human life for a person to have a certain measure of pleasure. Rather, the question is, what is his basic perspective? How much does he involve himself in this? Does he see himself as basically being born to enjoy or to work?" End quote. In other words, do we see ourselves first and foremost narcissistically as living for pleasure? Or do we see ourselves first and foremost as Avdei Hashem, those that are called here on earth to be servants of God? And he further mourned, Rav Lichtenstein, saying, quote, "To some extent, this feeling has permeated our world. A whole culture of enjoyment has begun to take hold." Now, one can certainly understand the concerns that Rabbi Lichtenstein put forward, and one is reminded of the famous, perhaps apocryphal story involving the Jewish observance of the 9 days. As many of you know, during the 9 days before the 9th of Av, the tradition is that one does not eat meat or drink wine. And in America, especially in New York, some of the best restaurants usually put out advertisements highlighting their 9 days menu in order to show that even though they can't serve meat, they've put together a special menu. In other words, so that you could still eat something absolutely delicious. And I heard when I was a student at yeshiva, I don't know if it's true, but the very fact that it could be true tells us something. That at one point, one of the advertisements featuring this menu began with the huge headline, "Now you can enjoy the 9 days." Okay? Of course, the whole point is to limit our pleasure in mourning for the temple. And here, now you can enjoy the 9 days. It is true that we can find some of the most wonderful luxury items today tailor-made for the observant Jew, the likes of which our ancestors could not even have dreamed. David Brooks once wrote an article in the New York Times about a tour that I gave him of the upscale kosher supermarket in Brooklyn, Pomegranate, which he described by writing, quote, "It looks like a really nice Whole Foods. There's a wide selection of kosher cheeses from Italy and France, wasabi herring, gluten-free ritual foods, and nicely toned wood flooring," end quote. So they had this article about pomegranate, made a big splash. And by the way, did I ever get a discount from Pomegranate for the amazing advertising? No. However, when I did shop there once after the article appeared, one of the people that was overseeing the store, maybe it was one of the owners, a Hasidic gentleman, came over to me to thank me for the article. And then he said to me something like, he said, "I was really happy that he mentioned the wasabi herring." Okay? So that is the age in which we live, ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, I have arrayed before me some of the most incredible forms of herring, twists on herring, the likes of which I think our ancestors would have been flummoxed to encounter. So along with your standard majas here, your standard schmaltz here, we have maple bourbon herring. We have over here a pistachio herring. We have an England-style herring, and I have no idea what that means. But we're going to sample all of these after the talk. But the fact is, even herring itself has gone upscale. It's gone luxury. It's gone foodie. And the truth is, therefore, that we might ask, is this too much? Is wasabi herring the ultimate embodiment of Judaism? Might we have reasons for concern? The truth is, though, there are undoubtedly Talmudic tales about Jews who, when it came to food, sought only the best and were willing to get only the best. And these people are celebrated by the Talmud, not criticized for being glad kosher hedonists. In fact, I actually think that the source for treasuring and paying for the best sushi and fish options can be found in rabbinic literature. Of course, the Jewish love of fish goes all the way back to Egypt because one of the complaints that was lodged by the Israelites in the desert was, "Zacharnu et hadaga asher nochal b'Mitzrayim chinam." We remember the fish that we ate for free. One of the original Jewish kvetchings in the desert was because they did not have the fish that they wanted to. This is described in the book about Yiddish called Born to Kvetch. One of the original kvetchings was about lack of good fish in the desert. Who knew that when you went out into the desert, you wouldn't be able to find fresh fish there? But the most celebrated love of fish is not in the Bible because that was bad that they kvetched there. The most celebrated love of fish is in the Talmud. And interestingly, this story features a fish that in the end was even more valuable than that purchased at the tuna auction by the tuna king of Tokyo. And this is the story of Yosef Mokir Shabbat, Joseph who honored the Sabbath. And I'll quote from one translation of the story, which appears in Shabbat. Yosef Mokir Shabbat, his name, Joseph who honors the Sabbath, had in his victory, meaning in his vicinity, a certain Gentile who owned much property. Soothsayers told him, meaning soothsayers told the Gentile, "Joseph who honors the Sabbath will consume all your property." So now he has a prediction that he has to worry about his wealth being taken by Joseph who honors the Sabbath. So he went, sold all his property, and bought a precious stone with the proceeds, which he set in his turban. As he was crossing a bridge, the wind blew it off and cast it into the water, and a fish swallowed it. Subsequently, the fish, was hauled up and brought to market on the Sabbath eve towards sunset. "Who will buy it now?" cried they, meaning the fish marketers were worried. We have nobody because everyone's gone home. This is an unbelievably beautiful and fresh fish. Everyone's always done their purchase for Shabbat. Go and take them to Joseph, who honors the Sabbath, they were told, as he is accustomed to buy. Meaning, if you have fresh fish right before Shabbat, there's a man who will spend anything for the finest fish. So they took it to him. He bought it, opened it, found the jewel therein, and sold it for 13 roomfuls of gold denarii. A certain old man met him and said, it's probably Elijah, he who lends to the Sabbath repays him. That's the story. Now we have to understand what's going on here. The tale is widely cited by rabbinic decisors as one of the central inspirations for the prominent tradition of eating fish in various forms on Shabbat. And there's been a great deal written on this Talmudic passage, utilizing a theological or a philosophical or a psychological approach. But no one really before me, I say this in all humility, as the greatest halachic fish expert in the world, no one before me has approached the story from the most important perspective, which is a culinary, sushi-based worldview. Let's think carefully what this text is about. The fisherman needs to unload a fish as the sun is setting. And they go to Yosef because they know that he will regularly, not only this week, but often, purchase fish right when Shabbat approaches. Why? Why does he want it right then? The answer must be because Yosef is the rabbinic equivalent of the Japanese tuna king. He is seeking the freshest fish possible because in a Middle Eastern country in the classical period, without the capacity for refrigeration, fish could go bad really, really fast. And to prevent that possibility required extensive preparation to which one would devote a great deal of time on Erev Shabbat. So how do you usually preserve fish if you don't want it to go bad if you buy it earlier? Now here we have to make a larger point, which is that people assume that the original word sushi always referred to fish that was eaten totally raw. But that's not true. In fact, sushi means sour tasting, so called because the original sushi, as I learned from the great website Gastro Obscura, was actually called narazushi, which was pickled fish, which had been pickled in fermented rice for a long time. As we're told by Gastro Obscura, it could be months or years that it would be pickled. And for the rabbis as well, fish would be preserved. Thus we are told that one of the activities that Rava, the great Talmudic sage, did in order to participate in the Shabbat, astonishingly, Rava's wife trusted him in the kitchen. And what Rava would do was that he would be malach shibuta. He would salt the shibuta fish. By the way, the shibuta fish, a fish of Babylon, of Iraq, was known by the rabbis as being the one fish that actually tasted like pork. And let me tell you, it tastes exactly like it. Oh wait, I've said too much. Okay, but nevertheless, Rava's job would be to salt it in order to preserve it. But if you buy it right before Shabbat, then you don't need to worry about preserving it because you're getting it as fresh as possible. So with that in mind, we're now able to analyze the larger story, focusing on the psychological portrait that it provides us. The mindset of these two men are being contrasted. How does this pagan Gentile in the story end up hearing this prophecy about his money? It's because he sought out a soothsayer. Why? Why does he go to see a soothsayer in the first place? It must be psychologically because he's obsessed with his money. He's always worried about it. All he can think about is his cash. And so he seeks the soothsayer because he's obsessed, and his obsession only increases as he hears the prediction. And now we have to ponder the literary meaning of this Talmudic image. This man who's obsessed with his money puts all of his cash into a jewel, and he then places it in a hat on his head. Think about the image literarily. His wealth weighs upon him. His money is literally on his mind at all times. The actual jewel atop his head is a symbol of his psychological state. In stark contrast, there is the man who is the object of his obsession, Joseph, who honors the Sabbath. But actually, that's how it's usually translated. But in Hebrew, Yosef Mokir Shabbat actually means Joseph who values the Sabbath. Mokir is like yakar, expensive. Joseph values the Sabbath, meaning he sees the ethereal, the sacred, the holy, rather than the material, as an end in itself. What's occurring here in the story is an agadic expression of the statement by Oscar Wilde, which is, the cynic knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. The soothsayer-seeking pagan knows the price of everything. But these prices are ends in themselves, and in the end it's his very obsession that is his undoing. Whereas for Yosef, the price in the material world is almost immaterial. For him, the value of the fish lies in the fact that it will help enhance his enjoyment of the Shabbat. The enjoyment is, of course, physical. It is culinary. It is delicious. It is about taste. But nevertheless, he is channeling that taste to honor the Sabbath. That's why the fisherman comes to him. They know that he alone, the fish king of the Babylonian Talmud, will pay them for the fish, not because he cares about the fish, but because he seeks to honor the Sabbath. The point, in other words, ladies and gentlemen, is that Judaism does not disregard enjoyment. Rather, it is against hedonism, which is a way of life in which the enjoyment of the best fish, the best meat, is an end in itself. The fish path of Yosef Mokir Shabbat is to take the best that one can get, to take the best enjoyment that one can find, and to be as creative as one can be in creating that enjoyment, and channel that enjoyment into sanctity. And that, in the end, is the Jewish history of embracing fish, of treasuring fish, and of placing fish at the very heart of Jewish cuisine. The truth is, some of the most famous Jewish fish experiences emerged when it came to Sabbath, and it emerged not in wealth, but in poverty, because it was these fish that ensured enjoyment of Shabbat in the most noble way possible. And it is this that brings us to herring, for we will see how this unfolds in two very different sorts of fish: herring and the fish that is known to many as gefilte fish. First, herring. The origins of the worldwide herring trade, which changed the world and really impacted the economy and the military engagement of the West, and I think safe to say, without herring, this synagogue and its congregation would not exist. And all these geopolitical facts are shared by Russell Shorto in his History of Amsterdam. In his book, he describes how herring was nothing less than one of the main reasons for the rise of the Netherlands as an economic and seafaring power. As he tells us, quote, for centuries prior to he says like this, he says that for centuries, quote, Dutch fishermen had plied coastal waters for the rich, oily, strongly flavored fish of the species Harengus and genus Clupea, aka herring. The fish were caught, hauled ashore, gutted and packed in brine to preserve them. The Dutch had no monopoly on the herring trade. It was a common activity in many northern European lands. And the Dutch, for a time, were regular customers of Swedish caught herring. But he adds further, however, Dutch fishermen developed an innovation that would transform Europe and in particular play a role in the rise of Amsterdam. It was the tiniest of things, and it was probably discovered by accident. Fish such as herring have little pouches in their stomachs called pylora caeca, which contain enzymes that aid digestion. If, instead of gutting the fish entirely, you leave these pouches as well as the pancreas and the brine mixture, the result is fish that keeps for a much longer period of time, and as a bonus, has more flavor. This discovery gave Dutch fishermen, theoretically at least, the ability to move away from the coastlines and into the deep, icy, impetuously heaving waters of the North Sea. End quote. In other words, if you could stay at sea longer because you can preserve the fish, then you can get more herring. And therefore, the Dutch said to themselves, in the words of the captain from the movie Jaws, we're going to need a bigger boat. And so they made bigger boats, but then of course you need other bigger military boats to defend the large herring boats. Thus did the Dutch conquer the seas and corner, as Shorter describes, the herring market. Quote, they shipped tons of herring to Poland, to France, up the Rhine into Germany, even as far afield as Russia. And then he adds, the government sent warships to protect the fleet, and over time it developed regulations covering every aspect of the netting, processing, and sale of herring. And that means that it was through herring that the Dutch became a world power. Without that, there would be no Dutch incursion into the New World. Without the New World, there would be no Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. Without the Dutch New World, therefore, there would be no rabbi of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue standing before you today with all this herring about to eat it. All because of herring. And indeed, for centuries, wars were waged over the seas and herring. Thus, this is told in the important work of scholarship, Herring, A Global History, by Kathy Hunt, who describes the battles between Britain and Amsterdam, and indeed, the British triumph over the seas, known well to those who know the song, Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britain never, never shall be slaves. The original war was waged over herring. Thus we are told that Prior to 1652, skirmishes had periodically broken out between English and Dutch fishermen, racing to land the first herring catch of the season. These fights paled in comparison to the all-out battles that were waged between the two countries over trade routes and fishing rights. After begun in 1652, this series of violent sea conflicts were known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars. After killing the Dutch Lieutenant Admiral Maarten Tromp at the Battle of Scheveningen in 1653, I was just in Scheveningen, I just want to point out, and I ate herring there. And capturing or sinking close to 1,500 Dutch merchant ships, England claimed victory in the First Anglo-Dutch War, which means that herring was one of the central issues in the battles between the Netherlands and Britain, and part of what led Britain to dominate the seas. And by the way, there were American battles over herring as well, because the United States, as she describes in the book here, in the Treaty of Washington, which was signed in 1871, America purchased rights from England to fish for herring in Newfoundland. But the Newfoundland-ish, I think, I'm going to go with that, fishermen didn't like it and actually sailed out and destroyed the American ships. And that was the only time that Canada defeated the United States in a war, unless, of course, you count the burning of the White House in 1812, which I do not count. But nevertheless, people take herring very seriously. Thus, herring itself changed the world and brought about originally the golden age of Amsterdam. And of course, once the herring was procured and once the science of preserving the herring was discovered, once herring could now be shipped without refrigeration all the way to Russia, to Germany and to Russia, the Dutch needed merchants with contacts across the continent. Fortunately, with the rise of Amsterdam, the city became a center not only of smelly fish, but also of religious liberty. And there was a new group arriving first from Portugal and then from Germany who could sell these fish, who had contacts across Europe. And of course, these are the Jews. And in describing this, we have to speak in praise of Chagall. And I speak here not of Marc Chagall, but rather his father, with the very sophisticated artistic name Chagall Mordechai Chagall. Chagall Mordechai Chagall worked in a herring packing factory, and his mother sold herring out of the house. And there was an Israeli art student who wrote an article about visiting Chagall's home in Vitebsk, Yoram Drori, and he noted that, quote, "The house in which Chagall grew up and gave his imagination freedom is small and quite depressing. The wooden portico was no more than a meter or a meter and a half and served as the parents' grocery store. Pickled fish were sold here in abundance, and there was little doubt that the smell of the Magis herring would have been overpowering." Magis herring, end quote. Magis herring, by the way, everybody know in the studio audience what Magis means in Dutch? Magis? Magis means maiden, and it refers to herring that have not yet reached spawning maturity. It's often brined with brown sugar and wine, and it takes on a reddish tint. But that is not the red herring to which our parlance refers. Red herring originated in smoked herring, another form of preservation herring, because herring is red when it's smoked. Why is the phrase red herring, why did it come to refer to a false, as people call it, a false flag? Nobody knows for sure. Some say it was because there was a priest somewhere that left his servant a box, and he said, "This box will really make you want to drink." And the servant assumed that meant he was leaving him all his wealth. And when he opened it up, he found one smoked herring. And so that was the source for the phrase red herring. Be that as it may, Magis is maiden pre-spawning herring. Schmaltz herring is herring with a regular herring, but with a certain high percentage of fat. So Chagall's father sold herring. Chagall's father worked in the drudgery of the herring packing factory. And the truth is, when you study Chagall's relationship with his father, you note that he seems to be conflicted. On the one hand, he clearly saw his father's job as a drudgery and didn't admire the work he did. On the other hand, he felt some connection to his father who actually paid for him to go to art school. Thus, Chagall wrote in his memoir, My Life, quote, "Must I talk about my father? What is a man worth if he is worth nothing, if he is priceless? That is why it is difficult for me to find the right words for him. My grandfather, a teacher of religion, could think of nothing better than to place my father, his firstborn son, still in childhood, as a clerk in a herring plant. and his younger son with a hairdresser. No, my father was not a clerk, but for 32 years simply a laborer, meaning a schlepper. He lifted heavy barrels, and my heart used to twist like a Turkish bagel as I watched him lift those weights and stir the herring with his frozen hands. His huge boss would stand to one side like a stuffed animal. My father's clothes sometimes shone with herring brine. Farther off, light from above would fall into reflections on every side. Alone, his face, now yellow, now white, would faintly smile from time to time. What a smile! Where did it come from? It whispered of the street where dim passers-by roamed about, reflecting the moonlight. So you have on the one hand this resentment at his father's work and the fact that his father's father, who was educated, made his son go into this work. But he clearly loved his father. And in fact, his mixed feelings about his father, a man who labored with herring his whole life, can be seen in a contrast between two paintings that Chagall made of his father early in life. The first actually hangs today in St. Petersburg, and it looks like this. As you could see, Chagall's father is very grim looking. Everybody see this? Very grim. Only matched by the grimness of his Bubba, who's also put here into the painting. But just 3 years earlier, Chagall, and this painting has a fascinating story because it belonged to somebody, the earlier painting, it belonged to somebody who was murdered at Auschwitz, and then the painting went out of the family's hands. Chagall himself bought the painting, I think in the 50s, not knowing who it had belonged to, and it was eventually restored to the original owner's family. And this painting is wholly different, and it was made only 3 years earlier, and it looks like this. And here you see the father's face radiant, a radiance which is matched by patches of white and luminosity on his capota. That's the herring brine that glowed. And so here you see the rays reflecting from him. In other words, we can see that on the one hand, this is a man that he maybe resented in part, but also a man whose clothes shone with herring brine and whose luminosity of herring brine merged with the luminosity of his smile, a smile that Chagall himself remembered. Chagall's love for his father can be seen clearly in the fact that throughout his many pictures that are tributes to traditional Jewish life, they very often feature flying fish. That's a tribute to his father and his love for him. Most famously this one, which features a fish floating in the sky like a blimp, along with a bride and groom here, highlighting a symbol of love. And then, of course, a chicken, because why not? Why not? I might as well just throw in a chicken also. But the flying fish is an important symbol because, of course, for Chagall, if you study Chagall, there was always flying or floating. The most famous, of course, is his painting Over Vitebsk, where you see a journeyman literally floating over the town in which he grew up, in which his father sold herring. The biographer of Chagall, Jonathan Wilson, describes that this painting as a pun, because usually we use the word Luftmensch, an airman, to describe somebody who's not that much involved in the world. But he's trying, as Wilson said, to turn that into a compliment. Or to put it slightly differently, the paintings reflect, we might suggest, floating as a sign of holiness in the midst of all that pain. And thus Chagall is giving tribute to the Jewish capacity to seek heavenly sanctity when all existence on earth was persecution. Thus, to make a flying fish is to see that in the midst of smelly poverty, even the smell of herring could be transformed into a source of pleasure and delight and Sabbath sanctity. Thus, if herring itself marked the Jewish capacity to take fish, to hold on to it, to sell it, and to eat it, especially, as Gil Marx notes in his Encyclopedia of Jewish Food, on Seudah Shlishit. And if they were all able to use it long before refrigeration, because herring was the one fish that could last, and which could travel even in Eastern Europe, where no one lived on the shore and it was hard to actually get any other kind of fish. We can understand how herring itself, as smelly as it might have been, became the centerpiece of the Sabbath table. If that is true about herring, that is also true of the other form of fish that became treasured, at least by Ashkenazic Jews, which is known as gefilte fish. However, the story behind it is often misunderstood. It is usually thought that gefilte fish emerged as a solution to a halachic problem. Thus, on the one hand, you need to eat fish on Shabbat. That goes all the way back to Yosef Mokir Shabbat. On the other hand, there is a halachic prohibition called borer, in which you're not allowed to separate unedible items in a mixture from the edible items. But if you're eating fish, unless you don't want to live, you need to remove the bones from the fish. Thus, Gil Marx writes in his Encyclopedia of Jewish Food, quote, "Fish, a symbol of fertility and blessing, has been traditional Sabbath and festival fare since at least Talmudic times. However, among the prohibited forms of creative work on the Sabbath is borer, to select, sort, meaning to separate undesirable items from desirable ones. Therefore, a person can remove the edible flesh from the bones on the Sabbath, but may not pick the inedible bones from the flesh. Since much of the fish in the Middle East was particularly bony, removing the flesh from the bones before the Sabbath was a practical way of preparing it." And then he adds, beginning in the 14th century, Franco-German rabbis discussed the permissibility of adding vinegar, which cooks the flesh, to chopped up fish on the Sabbath. And he further writes, medieval German and French cooks in upper-class households retained this practice. He writes, ancient Romans loved to skin animals, chop the flesh, and stuff it into the skin before cooking. Medieval German and French cooks in upper-class households retained this practice with pike, perch, and other large freshwater fish. So, end quote. In other words, so according to Gil Marx, Jews not only adopted this culinary tradition from German cooks, which obviously they did, but they did so in order specifically to avoid the halachic problem. This is a very common explanation for gefilte fish and its origin. But I'm sorry to say, and I say this out of family loyalty, it is almost certainly not true. Because my first cousin, the great historian of halacha, Dr. Chaim Soloveichik, points out that it is, of course, true that there is a prohibition of separating the inedible from the edible. But there were Jews that ate fish before gefilte fish was invented. And we find no record ever that anyone was ever criticized, ever, until it was brought up as a question in the 19th century. We don't find any case where Jews actually were criticized for removing the bones from their fish. This is the ultimate example of what my cousin, Dr. Soloveichik, calls mimetic tradition. That often there are things that would seem halachically problematic, but which Jews did for hundreds and hundreds of years without questioning it. And the point, perhaps, as my grandfather suggested, is that there is no halachic problem if you remove the bones in the process of eating itself. It's only prohibited to remove it in preparation beforehand. But if you're removing it while you're eating it, then there is no prohibition. The fact is, Jews ate fish before gefilte fish, and even after gefilte fish was invented, people that had other options aside from gefilte fish, we will call these people Hungarian Jews, also would eat regular fish instead of making gefilte fish, which was originally ground up fish stuffed in the fish skin, but then became the ground up fish fermenting itself. Thus, the truth is that everyone did this. A friend of mine, Rabbi Gil's student, wrote an article about how after he got married, he had gone to yeshiva, and there he was told that it's absolutely forbidden to remove bones from fish. And then he married a Hungarian Jew, and he went to his wife, and the first Shabbat, or on one of those Shabbatot, his wife's family serves fish, and they put down fish, and everyone's taking out the bones, and then they eat the fish. That was Hungarian fish. That's what people did. And so it is clear that gefilte fish did not emerge because of halachic reasons, but rather for economic reasons. The reason is, of course, poverty. Thus, Gil Marx further writes, quote, stuffed whole fish eventually emerged in medieval German Jewish cookery and was known in Yiddish as gefilte fish, meaning filled/stuffed. Originally, the bones were discarded and the flesh was carefully removed from the fish, chopped, mixed with matzah meal or bread, which acted as a binder as well as stretching the dish, and onions as both a flavoring and preservative, seasoned, stuffed into skin. The fish was then sewed up and roasted. And he adds, in this way, a small fish or even just the stuffed skin could feed a large family. That is why gefilte fish emerges. It emerges as well as a way of seeking to bring enjoyment into love of the Sabbath. Again, in the spirit of Yosef Mokir Shabbat, Jews who admired Yosef in his example but couldn't afford or find the fresh fish that he purchased for the highest price, created gefilte fish in order to sanctify the Sabbath itself. The recipes for gefilte fish were then impacted by the arrival of much more affordable ways of sweetening the fish, so that throughout Galicianer Jewry, gefilte fish suddenly became sweet, in contrast to Lithuanian Jewry, in which the gefilte fish remained savory, otherwise known as the correct way of producing fish. And indeed, strikingly, linguists have pointed out that you can actually find, and you can all Google this, what is called the gefilte fish line, which is that there is a line going straight down the middle of Poland, in which on one side people speak Lithuanian Yiddish and also eat savory gefilte fish, and on the other side people speak Galicianer Yiddish, saying things like Fleisch and Chagall, which are obviously the wrong pronunciations, and also eating sweet gefilte fish. Now the point, of course, as linguists point out, is not that the way you talk Yiddish impacts whether you put sugar into fish. It's that beet sugar was made readily available in Galicia, and that impacted the ability to make everything sweet. Challahs became sweet, gefilte fish became sweet. Pretty much, let's face it, pretty much everything became sweet. And so, therefore, one can say, as one article in NPR put it, about the gefilte fish line, one can truly say when it comes to gefilte fish, quote, "Tell us how you eat your gefilte fish, and we will tell you who you are," end quote. Thus, we can see how fish was at the center of the Jewish love of the Sabbath, not because it wasn't enjoyable, but because it was enjoyable. But the joy was not an end in itself. It was an attempt to find whatever they could and to make whatever they could make to feed whomever they could feed in order to bring holiness. The gefilte fish itself may not have actually flown, as in Chagall paintings, but luminous they were, as their Sabbath tables were luminous, as the family homes were luminous. The shine of homes like Chagall's parents in Vitebsk was not only the shine of herring brine, but was the luminosity of sanctity. And fish is at the epicenter of the Jewish story. We bear this in mind as we ponder our culinary experiences today, and the fact that now we have herring made, the likes of which our ancestors could only dream. And we will be eating it not only with standard kichel, in the way that many Jews ate, though that emerged really only in America, as a great article in Tablet described, in the kiddush that was done in early 20th century synagogues. But we have here not only regular kichel, but a veritable sampling of spicy sriracha kichel, 3 words that I guarantee you my grandmother never said in her entire life. Flatbread kichel, and perhaps most importantly, dill pickle kichel. Everybody here in the audience is now groaning, and you're all going to have some, okay? It's going to happen, even though, of course, we all know that really the only proper cracker to eat with kichel is Kimmel crackers. And this lecture has been brought to you by Kimmel crackers. Kimmel crackers, a delicious way to eat Kimmel crackers. I'm Meir Soloveichik. With this in mind, we can now truly appreciate how to approach the age of kosher foodism in which we find ourselves. David Brooks, pondering the Orthodox Jewish supermarket to which I brought him, wrote as follows, quote, "Another really impressive thing about the store is not found in one section but is pervasive throughout. That's the specialty products designed around this or that aspect of Jewish law. There are dairy-free cheese puffs in case you want to have some cheese puffs with a meat dish. There are the pre-cut disposable tablecloths so you don't have to use scissors on the Sabbath. There are specially designed sponges which don't retain water, so you don't have to do the work of squeezing out water on Shabbat. Pomegranate," he writes, "looks like any island of upscale consumerism, but deep down it is based on a countercultural understanding of how life should work." And he adds, "For the people who shop at Pomegranate, the collective covenant with God is the primary reality, and obedience to the laws is the primary obligation. They go shopping like the rest of us, but their shopping is minutely governed by an external moral order." And then he writes further, "Much of the delight in life comes from arguing about the law and different interpretations of God's command. Soloveichik," he's talking about me, Soloveichik laughingly describes his debates over which blessing to say over Crispix cereal, which is part corn but also rice. Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth, who was on a tour through New York, notes that the Jews are constitutional lawyers, and he quotes Rabbi Sachs, the Torah is an anthology of argument with a shared vocabulary of common restraint. Actually, it was on that day, I'm remembering nostalgically, when Rabbi Sachs, still very healthy then, visited New York. David Brooks went to interview him in his hotel. I picked up David Brooks from that hotel in my Honda Odyssey. And then as we're driving, David asked me, he says, is the Honda Odyssey the vehicle of choice for rabbis? And then we pulled into the parking lot of Pomegranate, and it was just Honda Odysseys all the way. And this lecture has been brought to you by Honda Odyssey. The truth is that in the end, when we come to the question of what we are to do, how we are to react to wasabi herring, no doubt delicious, the truth is that whether or not we ought to embrace this interesting example of food fusion and the others that we will experience today depends on whether our ultimate goal is hedonism or holiness, whether we use the best of life and the best food traditions from around the world in the way that fish was utilized in the shibuta, which was eaten by Talmudic sages and, as I've heard from members of our congregation, by Iraqi Jews back just 50 years ago, and like herring and like gefilte fish. The villain in the Simpsons show, whose name is C. Montgomery Burns, very wealthy man. There's an episode where he's visiting the school, and he's supposed to speak about how you succeed in business. So they ask him, please speak about what is the secret to success. So he gets up there before the children and he says, faith, friendship, family, these are the 3 demons you must slay if you wish to succeed. After all, when opportunity knocks, you don't want to be on your way to the maternity ward or sitting in some phony baloney church or synagogue. But the truth is that the lesson of the story of fish is that we are meant that if we really want to live up to the traditions of our people, we can use the best of life, but to enhance our experience of faith, friendship, and family. Then we endow the world with holiness and take earthly items and allow them to soar with sanctity. This is ultimately the lesson of the Chagall paintings that he has left us with the flying herring. We must cause our own Sabbath food to soar. And the same, it would seem, would apply to sushi. Joseph Berger in the New York Times wrote an article about the current Jewish obsession with sushi, and he interviewed Rabbi Moshe Elephant, quote, Chief Operating Officer of the Kosher Division of the Orthodox Union, the world's largest kosher certifier, who said, he writes, 80 to 90% of the city's 100 kosher restaurants now serve sushi, end quote. 80 to 90%. 80 to 90%. There's one that I go to sometimes, which in Borough Park, which is called Sushi Mishuna. Sushi Mishuna means different, which is not usually a compliment. So I asked them, why do you have that name? And they told me that their name was originally Sushi Meshuga, but that the mashgiach, the rabbi, didn't like that name and demanded the name be changed. This is true, I looked this up. I personally, if they want to make me the mashgiach, I would be fine with Sushi Meshuga, though I do have to say, when it comes to a different barbecue restaurant in Queens, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with the name Hakadosh Barbecue, which was actually its name, and I don't think that's going to work. That's a little too much for me. But the truth is, it's not bad to seize and enjoy what is mishuna, what is different, to be excited about what is new. The question is whether we make ourselves meshuga about it, whether like the original pagan soothsayer seeking, a money-loving man, we place materiality on our mind so that it weighs down on us at all times. Whether we live in the mode of Yosef, who honored the Shabbat and placed all joy on Shabbat or throughout the week at the epicenter of our holiness. Oliver Sacks, the eloquent writer about many, many subjects, was, like your humble speaker, a lover of fish. And some years ago, he wrote about his own herring obsession and how he went every year to a conference to experience the Neue Haring, the first fresh catch of June of the new herring of the Netherlands. And he describes their love just of the fish the enjoyment itself. He says, people had come to eat herring to savor them, to compare them. In its purest form, this meant seizing the new herring by the tail and lowering them gently into the mouth. The sensation this produces is voluptuous, especially as they slip down the throat. Guests started from this great central table, the altar covered with new herring, washed these down with aquavit, and moved on to satellite tables where there were majas herring, herring and wine sauce, herring and cream sauce, Bismarck herring, herring and mustard sauce, herring and curry sauce, and plum schmaltz herring fresh from Iceland. That's the original article he wrote. But then when he was dying, he wrote a very different article. And that was all about the fish that he grew up with, a fish called gefilte fish. He describes his mother's recipe and how his mother would cook it. And he writes, I thought I would never taste anything like my mother's gefilte fish again. But in my 40s, I found a housekeeper, Helen Jones, with a veritable genius for cooking. And then he describes how she would make him gefilte fish so he could taste what he tasted growing up in his parents' Sabbath home. As he was dying, he wrote as follows, I cannot eat more than 2 or 3 ounces at a time, but an aliquot of gefilte fish every waking hour nourishes me with much needed protein. Gefilte fish jelly, like calf's foot jelly, was always valued as an invalid's food. Deliveries now arrive daily from one shop or another. And then he writes, he just lists them, and then he writes, they all make their own gefilte fish, and I like it all, though none compares to my mother's or Helen's. While I have conscious memories of gefilte fish from about the age of 4, I suspect that I acquired my taste for it even earlier, for with its abundant nutritious jelly, it was often given to infants in Orthodox households as they moved from baby foods to solid food. Gefilte fish will usher me out of this life as it ushered me into it 82 years ago. And so it did just weeks after he wrote this article. Thus, he entered a home with holiness, in an observant home, and he left life remembering that, much as Chagall to the end of his days remembered his father's own herring. In the end, we will enjoy this herring, and you can enjoy sushi, omakase or otherwise. But the truth is that ultimately our goal with herring or sashimi or any other form of fish or any other form of food is whether we can endow it with holiness. I thank you all for joining me on this journey through culinary Jewish history. And I wish you all, in the words of Julia Child, a bon appetit, that you truly enjoy the food, but that you channel that enjoyment in a way that truly makes your food soar with sanctity. Thank you very much. And we're out. Thank you all. Let's eat, everybody. Let's eat, everybody. I got to catch a flight. You know what people recommend before getting on a flight? Eating as much herring as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Salt is the right.
Come on, everybody. Let's have l'chaim.
Yeah, there we go.
London. I'm taking YU students to London for a couple days. We're doing tomorrow night. We're doing an event with Andrew Roberts, my friend Andrew Roberts. How do I do that?
Andrew Roberts.
Okay.
Here. Everybody, please take.
Yeah, don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Use the Kimmel crackers. Try the sriracha. Kichel. I'll pour l'chaim. Thank you.
Thank you.
Blue label? Blue label?